The moment Claire Rodriguez turned to 1,000 people inside Daniel's hall on May 18th and said, "You're not my father," I felt every wire in my chest short-circuit at once. I just didn't drop the bouquet. Not yet. I stood there, 58 years old, 211 pounds of union electrician squeezed into a jacket that still smelled like conduit grease and copper shavings, holding a bunch of white carnations and a handwritten note that said 4 words. "Dad, proud of you." She didn't whisper it. She didn't pull me aside. She announced it to a graduation crowd like she was reading a verdict. And my son, Ethan, my own blood, sat 2 rows behind her and stared at his phone like the Wi-Fi signal mattered more than his father's heart stopping on a stage. I didn't know it yet, but that bouquet was the last gift I'd ever carry for someone who didn't want it. The next thing I'd carry would be an invoice. Welcome back to a father's silence. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, dignity isn't loud, but it echoes longer than any insult ever could. Subscribe so you never miss a story. My name is Ray Delgado. I'm a journeyman electrician with IBEW Local 20, out of Fort Worth, Texas. 31 years in the trade. Badge number 4417. I've pulled more wire through more walls than most people will ever see in a lifetime, and I've got the scarred knuckles and the blown-out left knee to prove it. I drive a 2009 Ford F-150 with 247,000 miles on it. The passenger side window doesn't roll down anymore, and the bench seat has a tear I patched with duct tape 6 years ago. I've never patched it properly because every time I think about replacing it, something else needs the money more. That's just how it works when you're a single father and a widower and the only paycheck walking through the front door. Maria passed 7 years ago. Ovarian cancer. She fought it for 14 months and never once complained about the hospital food, which tells you everything you need to know about the kind of woman she was. She left me with Ethan, who was 12 at the time, and with Claire, her daughter from her first marriage. I adopted Claire in spirit if not on paper. Maria had asked me to. "Ray, she doesn't have anyone else. Be her floor." That was Maria's word. Not rock. Not anchor. Floor. Because a floor is the thing you stand on without ever thinking about it. It holds you up and never asks for credit. So I became Claire's floor. I paid for Claire's braces when she was 16, $4,200 over 18 months. I drove her to prom in that same F-150, and I put a fresh air freshener on the mirror so she wouldn't smell the job site. I sat in the front row of every school play she was in, even the one where she played a tree and had no lines because showing up is the job. When she said she wanted to be a nurse, I didn't hesitate. I picked up overtime shifts, weekends at the Tarrant County Water Treatment Facility, running conduit through ceilings so low I had to work on my knees for 8 hours straight. My body screamed. My knee popped like a snare drum every morning. But I wrote those tuition checks to Cedar Ridge Community College. $15,000 over 2.5 years. Every check had a memo line, and every memo line said the same thing. For Claire, keep going. Here's the thing most people don't know about union electricians. We're trained to read blueprints. Not just electrical blueprints, structural, mechanical, architectural. You learn how a building is put together from the bones out. You learn where the load-bearing walls are. You learn what happens when someone removes a support that was never supposed to be optional. That skill doesn't stay on the job site. It follows you home. It follows you into relationships. You start to see which walls are structural and which ones are decorative. And you learn, slowly, painfully, that some people think you're decorative when you've been load-bearing the whole time. I kept a photo of Maria on the nightstand. Every night before bed, I tapped the frame twice. Once for Ethan, once for Claire.
Primer got, y de whisper.
I got 'em both. Claire was 24 when she started nursing school. She had a warmth about her when she first moved into the idea of healthcare. I remember one Thanksgiving, must have been 3 years ago. She brought home a blood pressure cuff from her anatomy class and insisted on checking everyone at the table. She wrapped it around my arm, pumped it up and said, 120 over 80. You're gonna outlive us all, Ray. She smiled when she said it. Genuine. Warm. That was the Claire I wrote the checks for. That was the Claire I drove to campus at 6:45 in the morning so she could make her 7 o'clock lab. I didn't know that version of Claire had an expiration date. The first sign was small. So small I almost didn't register it. It was February, about 3 months before graduation. Claire had started spending time with a new group from her cohort, nursing students who came from families with money. Country club families. The kind of people who say summer as a verb. One of them was a girl named Alyssa Whitmore, whose father was a cosmetic dentist in Southlake. Alyssa drove a white BMW and had opinions about everything, including other people's parents. Claire invited me to a study group dinner at a restaurant called Rosewood Table in the Clear Fork district. It was the kind of place where the menu doesn't have dollar signs, just numbers, floating there like they're embarrassed to be associated with money. I showed up in my cleanest jeans and a button-down I'd ironed that morning. I thought I looked fine. I thought I looked like a dad taking his stepdaughter and her friends to dinner. When I sat down, Alyssa looked at me, looked at Claire and said, "Oh, this is your stepdad." The way she said this told me everything. Like I was an item on a shelf she'd never buy. Claire didn't correct her. She didn't say, "This is Ray, and he's paying for my education." She just handed me the menu and said, "You might like the burger, Ray. It's simple. Simple. Like me." I ordered the burger. I paid the $340 tab for the table. I didn't say a word about it. The second sign came in April. Claire's pinning ceremony rehearsal, a smaller event before graduation where nursing students practice walking across the stage. Families were invited to attend. I took the afternoon off work, which cost me $280 in lost wages because I was on a prevailing wage job at the new hospital wing on West Rosedale. When I got to the rehearsal hall, Claire was already there with Alyssa and 2 other classmates. I waved. She saw me. I know she saw me because our eyes met for exactly 1 second. Then she turned back to her group and didn't wave back. I sat in the 3rd row for 45 minutes. She never came over. She never introduced me. When the rehearsal ended, she walked past me and said, "Oh, hey, you didn't have to come to this one. This one." Like I was on a guest list she hadn't approved. I drove home in silence and tapped Maria's photo twice that night. "I got I whispered, but my voice cracked on the second tap. The third sign was the smallest and it cut the deepest. 3 weeks before graduation, I was at the house fixing a grounding issue in the kitchen panel because that's what I do, I fix things, and Ethan was in the living room on a FaceTime call with Claire. I wasn't eavesdropping. The house is 1,100 square feet. You hear everything whether you want to or not. Claire's voice came through the speaker, tinny but clear. "Just make sure he doesn't wear that jacket, Ethan. I don't want people thinking I was raised by a handyman." Ethan laughed. My son laughed. I stood in front of that electrical panel with a voltage tester in my hand, and I watched the little light blink green, circuits live, circuits hot, and I thought, that's me. I'm live. I'm hot. And nobody's treating me like I'm carrying current. I didn't know it yet, but that overheard sentence, "raised by a handyman," would echo in a courtroom 6 months later, and it wouldn't echo in Claire's favor. I closed the panel. I went to bed. I tapped the photo twice. But that night, I didn't say anything to Maria. I just held the frame and stared at the ceiling until the light changed. May 18th. Daniels Hall, Cedar Ridge Community College. 1,000 people. Folding chairs set up in rows across a gymnasium floor that had been waxed so aggressively you could see your reflection in it. The air smelled like floor polish and drugstore perfume and the particular anxiety of parents who'd been waiting for this day longer than the students had. I wore my electrician jacket. Yes, that jacket. The one with the IBEW patch on the left breast and the faded American flag on the right shoulder and the name Delgado stitched above the pocket in gold thread that had gone almost bronze with age. I wore it on purpose. Not because I didn't own a sport coat. I do, a navy one I bought for Maria's funeral, but because this jacket was the reason Claire was sitting in that cap and gown. Every thread of it represented a shift I'd worked so she could sit there. I thought she'd understand that. I thought she'd see the poetry in it. I polished my work boots. Steel-toe Red Wings, 12 years old, resoled twice. I buffed them until they caught the overhead fluorescence. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a working man who'd worked for this moment. I bought white carnations, 11 of them, one for each semester I'd helped her through. I tucked a note into the bouquet, handwritten on a piece of cardstock I'd bought at the dollar store on Camp Bowie Boulevard. For words, Dad, proud of you. I meant it the way Maria would have meant it. Not proud of you like a credential. Proud of you like a floor saying, I held, and you stood, and look how tall you are. Claire's name was called. She walked across the stage. The crowd clapped. I stood up from my seat in the 5th row because I'd arrived 90 minutes early to get a good seat, and I moved toward the stage-left stairs with the bouquet extended. She saw me. The whole room saw me. A 58-year-old man in a worn jacket and polished boots, holding flowers, walking toward his stepdaughter with the kind of pride that doesn't need a spotlight because it generates its own. Claire stopped. She looked at the bouquet. She looked at my jacket. She looked at the crowd. And then she spoke into the open air of that gymnasium with a voice so clear it didn't need a microphone. Stop. The word hit the waxed floor and bounced. Don't hide behind your money. You're not my father. Give my tuition back and get off this stage. 1,000 people went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that has weight. I could hear the HVAC system clicking in the ceiling. I could hear someone 3 rows back unwrap a cough drop. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, steady and slow, because 31 years of working on live circuits teaches you one thing above all else. When the voltage spikes, you don't flinch. You assess. You isolate. You de-energize the circuit before it kills you. I looked past Claire to the 2nd row. Ethan was there. My son. 19 years old. The boy I'd taught to tie his shoes, to change a tire, to read a circuit diagram. The boy who'd slept in my bed for 3 months after Maria died because the dark scared him and I was the only light he trusted. Ethan was looking down. His phone screen glowed against his face. His thumbs were moving. He was scrolling. He was scrolling while his father stood on a stage being publicly disemboweled by the girl I'd helped raise with his mother's dying wish in my ears. That silence, Ethan's silence, was louder than anything Claire said. Claire's words were a slap. Ethan's silence was a blade. Because a slap tells you someone is angry. A blade tells you someone has decided you don't matter enough to defend. I looked at Claire. I looked at the bouquet. I set the carnations down on the edge of the stage, gently, the way you set down a live wire when you realize the circuit is beyond repair. Claire, I said. My voice was level, quiet. The voice I use when I'm telling a first-year apprentice to step back from a panel because there's 480 volts behind the cover and they don't even know it. I'm glad you graduated. I mean that. Then I turned and walked down the stairs, across the gymnasium floor, past 1,000 faces I'd never see again, and out through the double doors into the May heat. The sun hit me like a flashbulb. I stood in the parking lot next to my F-150 with 247,000 miles on it, and I put my hands on the hood, and I breathed. I didn't cry. I don't say that to sound tough. I say it because the tears were somewhere deeper than my eyes. They were in my hands, in my knees, in the place where Maria's voice used to live. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. 2 days later, Claire blocked my number. The day after that, I received an email from an attorney named David Pryor at a firm in Arlington. The email was 3 paragraphs long and written in the kind of language that turns human pain into legal procedure. It stated that the $15,000 I had paid toward Claire's tuition at Cedar Ridge Community College constituted a gift, and that any attempt to recoup those funds or contact Claire directly would be met with legal action, including a potential restraining order. A gift. $15,000 earned on my knees in ceilings and crawl spaces and parking garages. A gift. 27 months of overtime. A gift. 4 trips to the emergency room for heat exhaustion. A gift. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Claire had studied for her pharmacology exam while I quizzed her on drug interactions at 11 o'clock at night because she had a test the next morning and I had a 6 a.m. call time and neither of us cared because we were in it together, and I read that email 3 times. Then I closed my laptop. I made a cup of coffee. Black, no sugar, in a ceramic mug that said World's Okayest Electrician. A Father's Day gift from Ethan when he was 14, back when he still thought I was worth a mug. I sat with that coffee and I thought about Claire. Not the Claire from the stage. The Claire from the Thanksgiving with the blood pressure cuff. The Claire who called me at 2 in the morning during her first clinical rotation because a patient had coded and she'd watched the nurses do CPR and she was shaking and she needed someone to tell her it was okay. I'd driven to the campus parking lot at 2:30 a.m. and sat with her in the truck with the engine running for heat. And I'd said, "You're going to save people, Claire. That's worth being scared for." I felt something for that Claire. Something like grief. Because that Claire was gone, and the one who'd replaced her had a lawyer. But here's what I decided. Sitting at that table with my coffee cooling and the kitchen light buzzing the way it does when the ballast is going bad. I wasn't going to rage. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to post on social media or call her friends or show up at her apartment. I was going to do what electricians do. I was going to follow the code. I opened my filing cabinet, a steel 2-drawer unit I'd bought at an estate sale for $35, and I pulled out every receipt, every canceled check, every tuition statement, every email confirmation from Cedar Ridge's bursar office. 27 documents in total. I organized them by date. I paper-clipped them into groups. I put them in a manila folder and wrote on the tab in block letters. Claire, tuition, documented. Then I did something I hadn't done in 6 years. I called my union's legal aid line. IBEW Local 20 provides its members with access to a legal consultation network. Most guys use it for workers' comp or contract disputes. I used it for something else. I need to understand the legal difference between a gift and a conditional payment, I said to the intake coordinator. Can you describe the situation? I paid for someone's education based on a verbal agreement. She told me she'd graduate and make me proud. She graduated. She's not proud of me. And her lawyer says I gave her a gift. There was a pause on the line. Mr. Delgado, do you have documentation?
Ma'am, iman elektrician.
I document everything. It's how you stay alive. That night, I mailed one final invoice to the address I still had on file for Claire. Not a threatening letter. Not an angry note. An invoice. A clean, professional, itemized invoice listing every payment I'd made, every date, every check number, every corresponding tuition statement from Cedar Ridge. The total at the bottom, $15,000. The memo line at the top, services rendered in good faith. Payment terms, your conscience. I didn't know it yet, but that invoice would become Exhibit 14 in a proceeding that would reshape everything. When I got home that same night, I found a thick manila envelope wedged inside my boots by the front door. Stamped on the front, court service. Open at 6 a.m. The consequences I'd tried to keep quiet were finally knocking. Except they weren't knocking against me. They were knocking for me. That envelope contained a response from Claire's attorney. A preemptive motion to establish the payments as irrevocable gifts. Which meant Claire was scared enough to go legal first. And when someone goes legal first, it means they know they're standing on a floor that isn't theirs. The union's legal network connected me with an attorney named Sandra Munoz out of a small firm on West Magnolia Avenue. Sandra was 51, had a handshake like a pipe wrench, and wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck like a weapon she hadn't decided to deploy yet. I sat in her office on a Tuesday morning with my manila folder, and she spent 40 minutes reading every document without saying a word. When she finished, she took off her glasses and said, "Ray, you didn't give this girl a gift. You funded a conditional investment based on a relational promise. And she just put that promise in writing." How? Her lawyer's email. He described the payment as tied to graduation. That's a condition. The moment he admitted the money was connected to an outcome, he turned a gift into a contract. And contracts have remedies. Sandra filed a civil claim in Tarrant County on June 4th. Not for the full $15,000, for the full $15,000 plus $3,200 in documented overtime costs I'd incurred specifically to make those payments, supported by pay stubs and union timesheets. Total claim, $18,200. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Ethan. The first time he'd called me in a month. "Dad, Claire's freaking out." "About what?" "She got served. She says you're suing her." "I filed a claim, Ethan. There's a difference." She says you're trying to ruin her career before it even starts. She's a nurse, Ethan. I'm an electrician. We both know what it means to be held to a code. Silence on the line. Then, why are you doing this? Because she said I was hiding behind my money. I'm not hiding anymore. He hung up. I set the phone on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. That phone weighed 6 ounces. Felt like 60 pounds. Claire's attorney, David Pryor, sent Sandra a settlement offer in July. $5,000. A third of what I was owed. Sandra forwarded me the email, and I replied with one sentence. I didn't work on my knees for a third. Sandra sent that sentence verbatim to Pryor. I'm told he didn't respond for 9 days. During that 9 days, something else happened. The invoice I'd mailed, the one with payment terms, your conscience on the memo line surfaced. Not in court. Online. Someone from Claire's circle, maybe Alyssa Whitmore, maybe someone else, had photographed it and posted it on social media with the caption, "Imagine your stepdad invoicing you for being a dad. Toxic masculinity in a manila envelope." It went modestly viral in Fort Worth. About 4,000 shares. The comments were brutal, but not toward me. Person after person read that invoice and saw what it was. A working man's last act of dignity. A receipt for love that had been thrown back in his face. The tide turned in 48 hours. One comment stuck with me. A woman named Deborah, a single mother in Denton, wrote, "That man didn't invoice his daughter. He invoiced the world for thinking a stepfather's money matters, but his heart doesn't." I read that sitting in my truck in the parking lot of a Whataburger on Camp Bowie at 9 o'clock at night, and that's when the tears finally came. Not a flood. Just enough to fog the windshield. August. Sandra called and said Pryor wanted a meeting. Face to face.
No courtroom.
Just a conference room at Pryor's office in Arlington. I wore the jacket. The IBEW jacket. The one Claire didn't want to see. Claire was there. She looked different. Thinner. She wouldn't make eye contact. Pryor did the talking, offered $10,000 and a mutual non-disclosure agreement. Sandra looked at me. I looked at Claire. "Claire," I said. Same voice. Same level tone. Same 480-volt calm. "I don't want your money. I never wanted your money. I wanted you to look at me in that gymnasium and see the man who drove you to campus at 6:45 in the morning. The man who sat with you in a parking lot at 2:30 a.m. when you were scared. I wanted you to see your floor." She flinched. The word landed, floor, because it was Maria's word, and she knew it. "I'll take the full amount," I said. "Not because I need it. Because a debt is a debt. And I taught you better than to walk away from one." Pryor started to object. Sandra put one finger up, just one finger, and he stopped. The claim was settled in September. Full amount, $18,200. Claire's portion was covered partially by a payment plan and partially by, and I did not see this coming, her biological father, a man named Tom Ruiz who'd been absent for most of her life but who, apparently, had enough guilt and enough money to write a check when the alternative was a public judgment. But the money wasn't the revelation. The revelation was what Sandra found during discovery. Claire's social media messages, subpoenaed as part of the claim, showed a thread between her and Alyssa Whitmore from March, 2 months before graduation, in which Claire wrote, "I need to cut Ray off publicly so people stop thinking I come from that kind of family. It has to be big so no one asks questions later." It was planned. The humiliation on that stage in Daniels Hall wasn't a burst of emotion. It was a performance. Choreographed. Designed to sever me in front of witnesses so her new social circle would never connect her to a man in work boots. Sandra showed me that message on her phone. I read it twice. I set the phone down. I looked out the window of her office at the traffic on Magnolia Avenue, and I said, she learned the wrong lesson from nursing school. She learned how to perform triage, but she did it on the wrong patient. She cut off the part of her life that was keeping her alive. Sandra nodded. "You want to add emotional distress to the claim?" "No," I said. "I want to go home." 14 months later, I'm sitting on the back porch of a house I don't recognize. Not because I moved. I'm still in the same 1,100 square foot house in Fort Worth with the same patched bench seat in the F-150, and the same kitchen light with the bad ballast that I still haven't replaced. I don't recognize it because it feels different. Lighter. The $18,200 went into a savings account I opened at Frontier Bank on West 7th Street. I haven't touched it. I don't know if I ever will. It sits there like a monument to a lesson I didn't want to learn. I took a vacation for the first time in 11 years. 5 days in Galveston. I stayed at a motel called the Sandpiper that charged $79 a night and had a view of the Gulf from the second-floor walkway if you leaned over the railing at just the right angle. I ate shrimp po' boys and read a paperback novel about a man who builds a boat, and I fell asleep with the window open so I could hear the waves. It was the most selfish thing I'd done in a decade. It was necessary. I rebuilt my relationship with Ethan. Took time. It took a conversation in November where he sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "I was a coward at that graduation, Dad. I heard everything and I did nothing." "I know," I said. "Are you angry?" I was. "Now I'm just tired."
I'm sorry.
"I know that too." He comes over every Sunday now. We watch football. He's working at a distribution warehouse in Haltom City, trying to figure out what he wants to do. He mentioned he might apply to the apprenticeship program at the local. I told him I'd write him a recommendation, but I wouldn't pull strings. He said, "I wouldn't want you to. That was enough." Claire, from what I've heard through Sandra, struggled. She passed her NCLEX on the second attempt, not the first, and took a position at a clinic in Weatherford. Alyssa Whitmore dropped her after the social media backlash from the invoice post. It turns out that people who value you for your packaging lose interest when the packaging gets dented. Claire's biological father, Tom Ruiz, re-entered her life long enough to pay the settlement and then drifted back into whatever silence he'd been living in before. She was, by all accounts, alone in the way she had engineered for me to be. I don't celebrate that. I want to be clear about that. I don't lie in bed at night feeling victorious. I lie in bed at night feeling like a man who survived a house fire and is grateful for the air but still mourns the photographs. 6 months after the settlement, I received a letter. Not an email. A handwritten letter, mailed to my home address, no return address. The handwriting was Claire's. It was one paragraph. "Ray, I'm not writing to ask for anything. I'm writing because I took a patient's blood pressure yesterday and it was 120/80, and I thought of you at that Thanksgiving table and I couldn't breathe for a minute. I don't know how to fix what I did. I don't know if you'd want me to try, but I wanted you to know that when I check vitals, I still hear your voice telling me I was going to save people. I'm trying." I read it at the kitchen table. I folded it. I put it in the filing cabinet in a new folder. I wrote on the tab, "Claire, personal." I didn't respond. Not because I'm cruel. Because some circuits need to stay open for a while before you test them again. You don't rush a re-energization. You check the connections first. You make sure the ground is solid. You make sure nobody's going to get hurt. There's a woman at church, her name is Linda, who lost her husband to a stroke 4 years ago. She sits 2 pews ahead of me and always saves me a bulletin. We've had coffee 3 times. She doesn't ask me about the settlement or the graduation or Claire. She asks me about the Galveston trip, about Ethan, about whether I've fixed that kitchen light yet. I told her I'm saving it. She asked, "Saving it for what?" I said, "For when I'm ready for everything to work." She laughed. It was a good laugh. Warm. Like a circuit closing cleanly. I've been thinking about floors. Maria asked me to be Claire's floor. And I was. For years, I was the thing she stood on without thinking about. The thing that held her up while she grew and studied and became someone. And then one day, on a stage in front of 1,000 people, she decided the floor was embarrassing. She wanted marble. She wanted something that looked better to the crowd. So she tore up the hardwood and threw it away. But here's what I've learned, and I'm saying this as a man who has spent 31 years understanding how buildings stand and how they fall. You can tear up a floor. You can replace it with whatever you want. But if you don't respect the subfloor, the structure underneath, the thing that was there before the finish, the thing that held the nails, the whole room starts to sag. You don't notice it at first. A door sticks. A crack appears in the drywall. A window won't close all the way. And then one morning you wake up and realize the foundation has shifted. and the house you built on someone else's back doesn't feel level anymore. I was Claire's subfloor. She ripped me out, and now her doors stick. I don't say that with satisfaction. I say it with the quiet grief of a man who knows that some repairs are too expensive and too late, and the best you can do is build something new on ground that's yours. People ask me, Sandra asked me, Ethan asked me, even Linda asked me once over coffee, whether I regret paying that $15,000. Whether I'd do it differently if I could go back. And my answer is always the same. Pay it again. Every dime. Every overtime shift. Every ceiling I crawled through on my knees. Because the money was never about Claire earning my love. It was about me keeping a promise to Maria. And I kept it. The promise was to be the floor. I was the floor. What Claire did with the floor is Claire's story. What I did with the promise is mine. That's the thing about dignity. It's not a performance. It's not a comeback. It's not a revenge arc or a power play. Dignity is just the decision to stand in your own shoes. Polished Red Wings, steel toe, resoled twice, and know that the ground under your feet is solid because you made it solid. Not because anyone else said it was. This morning, I woke up at 5:15. Same as always. I made coffee in the mug that says World's Okayest Electrician. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the light come up over the backyard. A slow, amber thing, like the sun was taking its time, like it had nowhere else to be. The kitchen light buzzed overhead, that bad ballast humming its little broken song. I listened to it for a moment. Then I set down my coffee, opened the panel, and replaced the ballast. Took me 4 minutes. The light came on clean and steady, no flicker, no hum. Just light. Filling the room the way it was always supposed to. I picked up my coffee. I tapped Maria's photo twice. Once for Ethan. Once for the promise I kept. I got him, I whispered. And this time my voice didn't crack. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories.